Hello and welcome to Barod's next instalment of Facebook Live. My name is Rob and today be chatting about drug consumption rooms. So if you've got any questions, just pop them in the comments section and get back to you in terms of what the answers are to your queries. So hopefully you'll be able to answer them as best as possible. So just to give you a little bit of background, so I was really fortunate enough to do a Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellowship last year, and I looked into the procedures and the policies attached to setting up a drug consumption room. So I visited various consumption rooms throughout the world, including Insight in Vancouver, as well as some in Europe, as well as visiting areas and cities which at the time we're looking at establishing DCR. So I'll try and share some of that as well in terms of within this video as well. So first and foremost, what are drug consumption rooms? So many may know them via different terminology, so medically supervised injecting centres, supervised injecting facilities. One terminology that was used in the Parliament drugs debate yesterday actually was overdose prevention sites. They're pretty much all the same thing. In Wales, if you're kind of keeping on board with what we're doing here, we're terming them enhanced harm reduction centres. But just for the ease of this video, we'll just refer to them as drug consumption rooms or DCRs. So DCRs basically are facilities where people can consume illegal drugs in a clean, hygienic environment that is supervised. And the main aim really is to minimise the health risks and harms associated to consuming drugs, but not only to those individuals that are using the substances, but also to the communities, the residents, and just the general population as well. And I explain a little bit how everyone can benefit really from a drug consumption room as we go along really. So DCRs tend to be services that are offered under an overarching harm reduction kind of framework or strategy, or even just a harm reduction service. So I'll go through in terms of the different models, but as harm reduction, it's all about being pragmatic. It's all about kind of saying, well, yeah, people use drugs, so therefore how can we minimise the harm that is associated to that type of behaviour as well. So ultimately, DCRs, they're just about reducing the harm and the risks to everyone. Hopefully as we go through, I'll explain a little bit again how people benefit really from it. So DCRs really, there's tend to be like three main models. So tends to be, the main one is the integrated model. So what a DCR looks like within an integrated model is that it's just one facility of many. So if you take kind of traditional drug services now, you may have a drop-in, you may have needle exchange, access to dry blood spot testing, diversionary activities. A DCR would just be an add-on facility. So you've got a variety of different services in that. Another kind of model is a specialised one. So again, what that would look like is primarily the only service available would be a consumption room. So literally it'd be a room where people would just consume those drugs. You may have a couple of other services available, such as a needle exchange or access to medical care, but primarily it would just be that consumption. And then the third model is a mobile one. So that would look like, for example, a van that's just been decked out to allow for the consumption of drugs in a supervised way. Really. So that model would kind of be more suitable to like rural areas. So it could be in one area one day, could be a completely different area the next day. So especially if we take Wales, people living in really remote areas, it's about taking services to them rather than expecting them to come to us as well. The models can also kind of depend upon the staffing structure. So staffing of a DCR really fluctuates from one DCR to another depending upon the country that DCR is in. So if you take Insight in Vancouver, it's very medicalised. So a lot of the staff are medical professionals. So for example, primarily nurses. Whereas if you take the DCR in Germany, then a lot of the professionals there would be, for example, your classic drug workers. So they wouldn't necessarily be medical professionals like NHS staff, like nurses. So again, in terms of that can have implications upon the kind of model of operation really. What you tend to find in terms of the staffing as well is a lot of the DCRs will have like outreach workers as well. So if you've got individuals that are using within the vicinity of the DCR, then those outreach workers can go out there, they can engage with those individuals and try and bring them into the DCR just so they've got some form of contact with services as well. A lot of kind of the DCRs tend to have like a 3-stage kind of process attached to them. So you have like your reception area, and that's where people may, for example, be able to gain clean paraphernalia, so they may be able to get clean equipment in the reception area, but it could be very informal assessment takes place there. DCRs are all about being low threshold, so making it as easy as possible for individuals to access DCRs as well. The second stage would be the consumption room itself. And again, this can really vary from area to area and from DCR to DCR. So I would say the majority of DCRs in terms of consumption is primarily injecting only. So what you would see is if you go into a DCR that's injecting only, you'd have individual booths in a lot of them. Other kind of facilities would also allow smoking as well. So again, what you would enable people to do is, regardless of what form of kind of consumption, then a variety of different individuals can access a consumption room. So some of the DCRs in Germany and Denmark, for example, you would have one consumption room, but it'd be kind of split into two. So you'd have one bit for injecting only, and then you'd have a separate part of the room which would be closed off, but would still be overseen by an individual, a staff member, and that would be for smoking. What we're starting to see with some consumption rooms now is that they're allowing other modes of administration such as snorting as well. So again, the model can change from area to area. It really depends upon the need within that city, for example. In terms of within a consumption room, sometimes certain individuals can't access them. So in some DCRs, if you're under 18, if you're a pregnant female, they say no, you can't access. But again, other areas, so for example, some in Barcelona, they don't care, to be honest. They would just kind of say, well, if we've got a pregnant female coming to us, we'd rather them use in our facility rather than them actually go out and use in the street, because either way they'll use anyway. So it's about trying to reduce that harm as well. Some facilities will allow people who are on opiate substitute treatment to access, some won't. But what standardised rules you tend to find is that people can't inject one another, or that people can't pass stuff to one another when they're in the facility, because that could potentially be seen as dealing as well. But what you tend to find in all DCRs is that there is life-saving equipment. So primarily, and most of DCRs will have oxygen within the facility, and depending upon legislation, they'll also have naloxone as well. So thankfully in Wales, we've got the Take Home Naloxone programme being really positive in terms of the evidence that it's brought to Wales. But if you take Germany, for example, it's actually against the law for them to have naloxone on site. But they still have oxygen, and if needs be, they've got rapid access to emergency services as well from there. So in terms of DCRs, they're not a new phenomenon. They've been around since 1986. First one was set up in Bern in Switzerland. So you're looking at 32 years going strong now. And to this date, we've got 119 DCRs worldwide. The vast proportion are in Europe, so 87 of those 119 are in Europe. Those facilities that are outside of Europe are primarily in Canada and also Australia. More are due to be established, so Dublin being obviously one closest to home, potentially in Belgium, in 5 cities in Belgium as well, 3 in Lisbon potentially by the end of next year, and also more to be established in Australia, such as in Melbourne as well. And DCRs tend to be established for many reasons. So it could be that there's a huge amount of individuals using drugs on the street. So therefore that has implications on the amount of drug litter. So those kind of two types of behaviour poses huge risk to the local community, residents, businesses, as well as those people that are consuming those drugs and their family and loved ones as well. Glasgow, for example, one of the main reasons why they've been looking at it recently is due to the increase of HIV among people who inject drugs. So what we've seen in kind of other cities throughout the years is one of the main reasons is due to that rapid spread of HIV among people that inject drugs as well. So another big reason why cities, countries may establish a DCR is to do with the high levels of drug-related deaths. And what we're seeing in the UK, and especially in England and Wales, is that they're the highest since records began as well. So that's obviously a big factor. But in Wales, for us, it's about ensuring that everybody is kept safe. And if a DCR is needed, then that would be the main aim really with that as well. What DCRs are there to do is try and engage the most marginalised individuals on the street. So a lot of people, when they think of a DCR, thinks about a supervised environment for people that inject drugs. And for most of them, they are like that. So what DCR tries to do is get people who potentially would inject on the streets or inject on their own, in their own home, which is a huge risk in terms of potential fatality, and just to get them into the facility so they're supervised, but they're also using in those clean and hygienic facilities that ultimately reduce the health implications associated to drug use. And ultimately the evidence has been really positive. So there's a huge amount out there. Obviously we don't have any in the UK because we don't have any DCRs in the UK. So the evidence is kind of taken from other countries. But what we tend to find is that the impact on all stakeholders tends to be really positive. So what different areas have found is significant decrease in the amount of public drug use, and therefore significant amount in terms of decrease of drug litter. Sydney, for example, have found a significant reduction in the call-out of ambulances in relation to overdoses, because a lot of the overdoses are dealt with by staff in-house and therefore potentially don't need emergency services. DCRs also decrease behaviours that are associated to increasing the risk of contracting health-related issues such as HIV as well. So DCR tries and ultimately, to a degree, eliminates people sharing paraphernalia, which poses a huge risk in itself as well. And up until this month, there were no fatalities at all since the first DCR was established back in the mid-80s. So again, that just shows you in itself that the power that the DCR has as well. Also, as mentioned, it enables some of the most marginalised, vulnerable individuals, of which maybe traditional drug services don't fit in with, maybe services don't fit their need currently, but a DCR potentially may allow those individuals to get in contact with services. Because what that would do then is reduce that risk associated to a drug-related death, but it will also increase the opportunity for people to potentially access treatment. But again, that's dependent upon the individual and their needs as well from there. In terms of cost, that's one big thing that people are really concerned about, is actually how much would this cost? And again, it really depends upon the model, it depends upon the staffing structure. So if you've got a DCR that is hugely medicalised, lots of medical professionals that work from that facility, obviously it will cost a lot more than a DCR that potentially would only hire non-medicalised staff and be overseen by your kind of traditional drug workers. It also depends upon the need as well. So if you've got a huge cohort of public drug users, then potentially you're going to need quite a big facility to meet the needs of those. Whereas if you've got quite a small cohort, but it's still deemed that a DCR would help mitigate a variety of drug-related issues, then potentially that facility won't be as big and therefore won't cost as much as well. So it can really fluctuate. In terms of where DCRs are established, they're funded via various sources. So the vast majority of DCRs are funded by governments, but also in Spain, in Barcelona, it's funded by the public health, and other kind of DCRs are funded by the proceeds of confiscated crime account. So again, it can come via different avenues as well. So what we're probably seeing, the most expensive one in the world, and it's got everything, you're probably looking at around £3 million a year, but don't worry, that's not something we would look at in Wales. It'd be nowhere near that as well. So potentially, you could be looking at a DCR costing around £100,000 to £200,000 a year, but it can be really cost effective. So if you take the lifetime treatment cost of HIV, you're probably looking at just under £400,000 for a lifetime treatment. If, for example, one individual who is undertaking behaviours that really increase the risk of contracting HIV, if they engage in a DCR and use the DCR, potentially you would stop that individual contracting HIV, so therefore your kind of cost savings there already, and you kind of pay for your DCR there straight away. So they can be really cost effective overall as well. So where are we in Wales? So Wales, we're absolutely no different in terms of public drug use in our towns and cities compared to the rest of the UK, but also compared to the rest of the world as well. So it happens. We have to be realistic about that. So therefore we have to look at what risk that poses, not only to those individuals, but also to the local communities, to the residents, to the businesses as well. So what we got in Wales 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago, we set up the Enhanced Harm Reduction Centre Steering Group. It's a multidisciplinary group that's made up of third sector representation from substance misuse, housing agencies. We've got health-based representation on there. We've got academics. We've got representation from the police and crime commissioners on there as well. We've got legal advisors. We've got service users on the forum as well. Apologies if I missed anybody out. But ultimately what we're doing as a group is we're currently looking at the need. Is there a need for a DCR in Wales or multiple DCRs in Wales to help mitigate those health-based issues associated to drug use, whether that be due to high levels of public drug use, high levels of discarded paraphernalia, the risks it poses to the local communities, also potentially in terms of those drug-related deaths. In Wales last year in 2017, it was the second highest on record. The highest was the year before. So just in drug-related deaths, that is a potential factor in terms of the need for a DCR. So we're looking at a really robust needs analysis that will then determine whether a DCR is needed in Wales. We've also got a POSSM, so the Advisory Panel on Substance Misuse. So they advise the Health and Social Services Secretary, Vaughan Gething, on anything substance misuse related in Wales. They're the Welsh version of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, the ACND, who advise the UK government as well. So a POSSM, they did a report back end of last year on the potential need of a DCR in Wales, and that report can be found on the Welsh Government website as well. So there's lots going on in Wales as well. If it was to be established in Wales, ultimately it would all be about improving public safety and minimising the risks associated to public drug use for a variety of different communities as well. Also, it would be about reducing health-related risks and harms associated to drug use, again for the wider community, but for those individuals that use drugs, as well as their family and loved ones. And also it's about improving the health and well-being of people who use substances, and again the general population, as well as reducing the amount of premature fatalities that we see in Wales ultimately as well. In terms of the concerns, just be really pragmatic because they are out there. This is something we hear quite a lot of. So one concern is that kind of not in my backyard kind of argument, in that people say, yeah, we're up for a DCR if it's needed, definitely, but I don't want it on my street. DCRs are only established where there's a need. There's no point putting a DCR in an area that just doesn't have any history or current kind of public drug use, because people won't go there. So if a DCR is established in your area, sorry to be blunt, but chances are public drug use is already happening, and this will be a significant amount from there. So they'll only be put where there is a specific and significant amount of need. Also, one big concern is that the honeypot effect. What that means is basically people will come to the area. So therefore you have more drug users if you use that terminology, in that one area. Actually, what evidence suggests is people will really not travel that far to access a DCR. So therefore, it goes back to it being really important in it being established where there is a need. So what evidence tends to suggest is people won't really travel as far as 1.5 kilometres to access a DCR. So if we were to set one up in Swansea, chances are in the city centre, chances are not many people from the outskirts of Swansea would come in to access the DCR, never mind people from Bridgend or Cardiff as well. Other kind of concerns is that a DCR would lead to increasing crime, especially drug-related crime, kind of drug use in the area. Evidence suggests that that just is not the case at all. And what DCRs are based upon and built upon is strong foundations and relationships with local partners and stakeholders. So the police play a huge part in terms of the establishment and the operation of a DCR. So if there are issues around a DCR or in the area, then ultimately that's where those links with the police forces come in as well. And again, one thing people say is that a DCR encourages drug use. DCR is just all about harm reduction. It's pragmatic. And it's all about minimising the health-related issues associated to drug use. So again, people have always used drugs, they will continue to use drugs. A drug-free world is kind of impossible to a degree. We don't really want that either because of the medicalised side of substances. But DCRs are just like needle exchanges, they're just like naloxone, they're just like safer drinking tips. It's all about harm reduction. And therefore, it's about just minimising those health-related implications. So what next? So if a DCR was to be established in Wales, first of all, and the easiest way to do that would be ultimately for the UK government to give the green light legally. So their advisors, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, kind of form, the ACMD, has actually advised the UK government to look at it and potentially set up DCRs. But ultimately, the government, from a legal perspective, is kind of blocking them. I think their main fear is that basically a DCR would knowingly allow people to possess illegal drugs within a facility. So that's obviously one of their big concerns. A DCR could operate under a letter of comfort, similar to needle exchanges, how they operate now. So that will primarily be signed off by the police forces, but it will be a multidisciplinary consensus between police force, local authority, health-based services, and also substance misuse services as well from there. But there is hope. Harm reduction initiatives are kind of ongoing. We've seen the success naloxone has had in Wales, we've seen the success of needle exchanges, and most recently the success of what drug testing has had in festivals. The government hasn't blocked those, it's kind of stayed quiet on it, but I believe that they really do start to see the benefit of harm reduction initiatives like that, such as drug testing. So there is the potential that actually DCRs could be a go-ahead if there is a need in the near future in Wales. As a group, as the Enhanced Harm Reduction Centre Steering Group, if we believe that there is a need, we'll look at feasibility of that and ultimately we'll progress with our kind of motion of potentially setting up a DCR as a way to just try and reduce all those risks and harms associated to drug use, in particular public and lonesome drug use, for everybody, for the local community, for the residents, the businesses, as well as those people that use drugs. That's all we've got for today. I know it's a lot of information. I may have missed some stuff out, so if you have any questions, if you want to know more, just pop a comment and we'll get back to you as soon as we can.